This says, Barack Obama, seriously? The officer's skeptical tone cut through the airport's chaotic hum. Barack Obama, calm as ever, handed over his ID, his polite smile unwavering. Around him, travelers exchanged stunned glances, whispers, rippling through the crowd. The officer's eyes narrowed. "I'll need further verification." The air grew thick with tension. Was this just protocol, or something far more insidious? What would you do if someone questioned your identity like this? Comment where you're watching from, like and subscribe for more powerful stories. The airport was alive with movement and sound, a microcosm of the world in transit. A sea of travelers hurriedly dragged suitcases across the polished floors, their voices blending into a symphony of urgency. Overhead, the mechanical hum of departing flights and the rhythmic announcements of boarding gates echoed. Final call for Flight 247 to London, blared a crisp, automated voice, followed by a string of names urging late passengers to their gates. Lines at security checkpoints stretched endlessly, filled with weary faces that told stories of long journeys and impatient waiting. Children tugged on their parents' hands, while some passengers stared intently at their phones, oblivious to the commotion around them. The faint aroma of coffee wafted from a nearby cafe, mingling with the sterile smell of metal detectors and cleaning agents. Amid this organized chaos, the occasional heated exchange broke out, misplaced tickets, forgotten IDs, or an overzealous security officer demanding travelers empty their pockets for the third time. It was an ordinary day at the airport, yet it bristled with attention only those traveling under strict schedules or heightened nerves could feel. The stage was set for something extraordinary to break the rhythm. In the middle of the serpentine, security line, stood a man who could have easily been mistaken for an ordinary traveler. Barack Obama, the former president, had chosen simplicity over spectacle for this journey. A navy blue hoodie draped loosely over his frame, paired with jeans and comfortable sneakers, allowed him to move without attracting undue attention. He held his passport and boarding pass in one hand, his posture calm and composed. His shoulders carried the weight of someone used to being observed, yet his expression was one of practiced ease. A subtle smile lingered on his face as he glanced around the crowded terminal. "Is that?" "No, it can't be," someone whispered from a few rows back. A hushed debate ensued among a group of travelers. Obama, ever attuned to his surroundings, caught snippets of their conversation but gave no indication that he had heard them. His presence, understated and dignified, hinted at a man who had spent years learning to navigate the delicate line between anonymity and recognition. For now, he was just another passenger waiting to clear security, until the unexpected turned his day into something far more profound. Janet Miller stood rigidly at her station, her uniform impeccably pressed, but her demeanor sharp and unyielding. The mid-afternoon rush had been unrelenting, and her patience, already frayed from a long day of dealing with irritated travelers, was wearing thin. Each beep of the scanner seemed to hammer at her nerves. "Step forward. Next." Her voice carried a clipped efficiency, but there was an unmistakable edge to her tone. Janet prided herself on being thorough, too thorough, some would argue, but she believed it was the only way to maintain control in a chaotic environment. Her eyes darted from passenger to passenger, scanning not just their documents, but their faces, their clothes, their demeanor. Years on the job had made her confident in her intuition, though it often strayed into judgment. A man with a mismatched passport photo earned her scrutiny. A young woman with an accent faced her, pointed questions. To Janet, it wasn't prejudice, it was protocol, but beneath the surface of her professionalism lay biases she would never admit to. Her curt mannerisms and dismissive glances toward certain individuals hinted at deeper assumptions she held, shaped by years of subtle reinforcement. She wasn't overtly malicious, but her actions often reflected an internalized prejudice she had never confronted. When Barack Obama stepped forward in line, Janet's gaze immediately sharpened. There was something about him, his calm confidence, his understated demeanor, that set her on edge. The name on his ID made her pause, her expression darkening as she studied it. "Barack Obama?" she muttered under her breath. Doubt already, clouding her judgment. To her, he wasn't a former president. He was just another traveler to be scrutinized, perhaps more so than the others. Jake Turner leaned against the edge of his desk, scanning the terminal through the large glass windows of his office. As the airport's youngest manager, he prided himself on being a problem solver, someone who could handle the chaos with fairness and empathy. His enthusiasm for maintaining order and upholding ethics had earned him respect among his peers, though not without challenges. Jake's desk, cluttered with procedural manuals and sticky notes, symbolized his constant juggling act, keeping operations smooth while ensuring that every passenger was treated with dignity. His idealism often clashed with the rigid structure of airport protocols, but he believed in striking a balance. A faint buzz from his earpiece interrupted his thoughts. "Jake, we have a situation at Security Checkpoint C," a voice informed. "Him." With a sigh, Jake grabbed his tablet and headed toward the checkpoint. As he walked, he reflected on how the weight of his responsibilities often forced him to navigate murky waters, between upholding the rules and confronting the uncomfortable truths they sometimes concealed. When he arrived, the sight of a tall man calmly standing in front of a visibly tense officer caught his attention. Something about the scene told him this was more than just a procedural hiccup. Maria Sanchez adjusted the strap of her carry-on bag as she waited in the security line. A frequent traveler, she had developed a keen eye for spotting tension in airports. Today, however, something felt different. As the line shuffled forward, Maria noticed a man standing near the checkpoint. His face seemed familiar, too familiar. Squinting slightly, she gasped softly, "Barack Obama." Her heart quickened. Maria had admired him for years, not just as a leader, but as someone who embodied grace under pressure. Yet what she saw now troubled her deeply. The officer scrutinizing his documents wore an expression that Maria had encountered many times before, doubt mixed with quiet hostility. Maria observed as the exchange grew tense. The officer's tone sharpened, and though the man remained calm, Maria could see the subtle signs of weariness in his posture. It was clear that this was no ordinary check. Something more insidious was at play. Frowning, Maria shifted her position to get a better view. She knew she couldn't intervene just yet, but her resolve grew stronger with each passing moment. If this confrontation escalated further, she was determined to stand up and make her voice heard. The scene at the security checkpoint began to attract attention. Passengers waiting in line or passing by slowed their steps, their curiosity piqued by the unusual commotion. A few leaned in to catch snippets of the exchange, while others averted their eyes, choosing to remain uninvolved. A middle-aged man in a business suit whispered to his colleague, "Is that Barack Obama?" "What's going on over there?" His companion shrugged. "Probably just protocol. Nothing to get worked up about." In contrast, a young woman with earbuds dangling from her ears frowned as she watched the interaction. "This doesn't feel right," she murmured to herself, her hand unconsciously gripping the strap of her backpack. An older couple nearby exchanged worried glances. "Why are they giving him such a hard time? It's obvious who he is," the woman said softly, but her husband shook his head, urging her not to get involved. The crowd's reaction was as varied as the people within it. Some were visibly uncomfortable, their faces etched with concern, while others chose indifference. Unwilling to engage, The moment mirrored a societal truth. Not everyone responds to injustice, even when it unfolds right in front of them. Janet held Obama's ID in her hand, her brow furrowing as she scrutinized it with an exaggerated air of authority. Her eyes darted between the photo and the man standing before her, her lips pursed tightly. "Barack Obama," she said, her tone dripping with skepticism. "Is this some kind of joke?" Obama, standing tall yet composed, replied in his signature calm voice, "No, ma'am, that's my name, and these are my documents." Her suspicion deepened as she glanced over the papers again, searching for a flaw. "You expect me to believe this? I'll need additional proof of identification," she said, her tone now condescending. The tension in the air was palpable. Travelers paused, straining to hear the conversation as whispers rippled through the crowd. Maria clenched her fists, her face reflecting growing outrage, but she held back for now. Obama, though visibly weary, responded with unshaken poise. "You're welcome to verify my credentials with your supervisor," he offered. Janet's eyes narrowed. Her stance wasn't just about following protocol, it was personal. The room felt heavier as the situation escalated, every second stretching into an eternity for those watching and waiting for what would happen next. How would you react if someone you admired was being unfairly targeted right before your eyes? Would you speak up or remain silent? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Janet adjusted her glasses, holding Barack Obama's ID at arm's length, as though the distance might reveal some hidden flaw. The room was quiet except for the hum of the conveyor belts and the occasional beep of the scanner. Her expression hardened as she squinted at the identification card, flipping it back and forth as if waiting for it to betray some forgery. "This doesn't look right," she muttered, half to herself and half loud enough for others to hear. Obama, calm but visibly tired, replied evenly, "I assure you everything is in order. I travel frequently, and these documents have never been an issue." Her gaze snapped up to meet his, and her tone turned sharper. "Frequent or not, it's my job to ensure no one bypasses security protocol, regardless of who they are or who they claim to be." Passengers around the checkpoint exchanged uncertain glances, the tension in the air thickening. Maria, standing a few spots back, crossed her arms tightly over her chest, her brows knitting in silent disapproval. "Let me ask you this," Janet continued, her voice rising slightly. "How do I know this isn't a cleverly constructed fake? People try all kinds of things. And the name on this—" She paused, her eyes narrowing. "Barack Obama. Really?" Obama's jaw tightened subtly, but he maintained his composure. "You're welcome to call your supervisor or check with additional resources if you have doubts." Janet ignored the suggestion, leaning into her authority instead. "It's not just about the name," she said, holding the ID up to the light once more. "The picture, the font, something just feels off about this." Her words dripped with insinuation, her demeanor no longer professional, but deeply accusatory. The implication that Obama, a man whose face had been known worldwide, might be using a fake identity was not lost on those watching. A ripple of discomfort spread through the onlookers, and murmurs of protest began to rise, though softly. Janet's actions had crossed into the realm of blatant prejudice, her scrutiny no longer grounded in procedure, but in something much harder to justify. Maria couldn't hold back any longer. The quiet outrage simmering within her bubbled to the surface as Janet's tone grew harsher, her words dripping with unwarranted suspicion. Maria stepped forward, her voice calm but firm, cutting through the uneasy silence that had settled over the checkpoint. "Excuse me," she began, her expression one of polite incredulity. "Are we seriously questioning the identity of Barack Obama, a man whose face is recognized around the world?" Janet's eyes darted toward Maria, her frown deepening. "Ma'am, I'm doing my job. Protocol requires thorough checks for everyone." Maria tilted her head slightly, her voice unwavering. I understand that, but don't you think this has gone a bit too far? You've had his documents for several minutes and nothing about them suggests anything is wrong. Are you sure this is still about protocol? A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. A few heads nodded. Others whispered among themselves, emboldened by Maria's words. Janet straightened, gripping the ID in her hand as though it were a lifeline. "It's not your place to question my process," she said, her voice defensive. "Security procedures are in place for a reason, and I have the authority to verify any document I deem suspicious." Maria's eyes narrowed slightly, her frustration evident, but she kept her tone measured. "And what exactly is suspicious about his documents? Is it the name, the photo, or is it something else entirely?" Janet's cheeks flushed, but she didn't back down. "I don't need to explain myself to you or anyone else," she said, her tone firm. "If you're concerned, you can file a complaint later. Right now I'm handling this." Maria exhaled deeply, glancing at Obama, who stood silently, observing the exchange with a calm intensity. She wanted to say more, to press Janet further, but she knew the situation was teetering on a delicate edge. The tension in the room grew thicker, the confrontation now a public spectacle drawing even more attention. Despite Janet's attempts to assert control, Maria's intervention had planted a seed of doubt in the minds of those watching, further amplifying the discomfort surrounding the officer's actions. Barack Obama stood at the security checkpoint, his calm exterior beginning to crack under the weight of Janet's relentless scrutiny. His hands remained steady at his sides, but his jaw tightened ever so slightly, a subtle sign of his growing frustration. He had dealt with situations like this before, moments where subtle prejudice masked itself as protocol, but it never got easier. "I've provided everything you've asked for," he said, his voice measured but firm. "My documents are valid. My identification is clear. What more do you need to resolve this?" Janet, flipping through his documents for what felt like the 10th time, barely looked up. "As I said, I'll determine when everything checks out. Until then, I'll need you to wait." The words hit harder than they should have, not because of their content, but because of the context. This wasn't about following protocol anymore. It was personal. Obama glanced around, noting the shifting energy of the crowd. Some passengers avoided eye contact, choosing to stay out of it, while others watched intently, their expressions a mix of disbelief and quiet support. A flash of memory surged through his mind. Another moment years ago, early in his presidency, when he had faced a similarly veiled insult. He had smiled through it then, choosing to rise above, but the sting of such moments never truly faded. They lingered, gnawing at the edges of his resolve, reminding him that no position, no accomplishment, no title could fully shield him from prejudice. Taking a deep breath, he spoke again, his tone edged with irritation. "Ma'am, I've been patient, but this is bordering on unreasonable. If there's a problem with my documents, state it clearly. If not, I'd appreciate it if we could move this along." Janet's eyes flicked up, her expression unreadable. "I've told you, sir, this is standard procedure." Obama couldn't suppress the faint flicker of disbelief that crossed his face. "Standard procedure," he repeated, his voice lowering slightly. "I've traveled through airports around the world, and I can assure you this doesn't feel standard." Maria, standing a few feet away, clenched her fists, her frustration mirroring Obama's. She could see the subtle shift in his demeanor. The carefully composed mask he always wore was slipping, revealing the exhaustion of someone who had carried the weight of systemic prejudice for far too long. As Janet continued her unnecessary delay, Obama's thoughts drifted to the bigger picture. This wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had ever been unfairly targeted, every person who had ever been made to feel small under the guise of rules. He straightened, his eyes steady and unwavering. "I trust you'll do the right thing," he said, his tone calm, but now laced with unmistakable authority. The words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. For the first time, Janet hesitated, but her defiance remained intact, keeping the tension alive. The atmosphere around the security checkpoint had shifted completely. What had begun as a routine process had now turned into a spectacle. Travelers slowed their steps, some craning their necks to see what was happening, while others whispered amongst themselves, their words barely audible over the steady hum of the airport. "Isn't that Barack Obama?" a young man murmured to his companion, his voice tinged with disbelief. "It sure looks like him," the other replied, his gaze fixed on the scene. "But why are they holding him up like that?" Nearby, an older woman shook her head, her face creased with concern. "This isn't right," she said softly to no one in particular. "Everyone knows who he is. Why can't they just let him through?" Despite the growing discomfort among the onlookers, most remained rooted to their spots, unwilling to step forward. A few passengers exchanged knowing looks, their silence speaking volumes. It wasn't indifference, it was fear. Fear of confrontation. Fear of stepping into a situation they believed wasn't theirs to fix. Maria, however, stood out among them. Her posture was tense, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, as she watched the exchange with barely concealed frustration. She glanced around, hoping to see someone else intervene, but the faces around her remained passive. A man in a suit muttered to his colleague, "Why draw attention to yourself? It's not our problem." But the whispers of discontent grew louder. A young mother holding her child looked visibly uncomfortable, her lips pressing into a thin line as she whispered something to her partner. A group of college students in the corner began recording the scene on their phones, their expressions, a mixture of curiosity and outrage. Despite the growing tension, no one stepped forward. The collective hesitation of the crowd reflected a deeper truth about injustice. While many recognize it, few are willing to challenge it in the moment. The unease lingered, an invisible weight pressing down on the room. Everyone was waiting for something, anything, to break the silence. The burden of action loomed, but for now it was left in the hands of those already at the center of the storm. The buzz in Jake Turner's earpiece pulled him out of his thoughts. "Jake, we've got an issue at security checkpoint C," came the voice of one of his supervisors. "It's turning into a bit of a scene." Jake sighed, grabbed his tablet, and headed toward the checkpoint. Issues weren't uncommon during peak travel hours, but something in the supervisor's tone made this feel different. As he weaved through the throng of travelers, he mentally prepared for what awaited him. Approaching the checkpoint, he immediately sensed the tension in the air. A crowd had gathered, their hushed murmurs punctuated by occasional exclamations. At the center of it all, Jake spotted Janet, the seasoned but often inflexible officer, standing rigid with an ID in her hand. Opposite her was a tall man, calm, yet visibly weary. Jake froze for a moment, his eyes widening as recognition hit him. Barack Obama? Jake's steps slowed as he tried to process the surreal nature of the scene. Why was Janet holding him up? This wasn't just a high-profile individual, this was a former president. The gravity of the situation landed heavily on Jake's shoulders. He cleared his throat and approached cautiously. "Janet, what's going on here?" Janet turned, her expression shifting slightly at the sight of her manager. She gestured to the ID in her hand. "This gentleman presented these documents, but I find them unquestionable. I'm just following protocol, Jake." Jake frowned, glancing at Obama, who met his gaze with an expression of calm authority. "Questionable?" Jake asked, his tone careful. "In what way?" Janet hesitated, her stance defensive. "The name, the photo, it just seems unlikely. I mean Barack Obama traveling alone, casually dressed. It doesn't add up. Jake's jaw tightened. He knew Janet had a reputation for being thorough, but this was something else. Her words, veiled as procedural concerns, carried undertones. That couldn't be ignored. "I see," Jake said slowly, taking the ID from her hand. He examined it briefly, noting its authenticity. He looked back at Janet, his inner conflict clear. On one hand, he needed to back his staff. Showing doubt in her decisions could undermine her authority. On the other hand, what he was witnessing felt wrong on every level. Jake turned to Obama. "I apologize for the delay, sir. Let me handle this personally." Obama gave a small nod. "I appreciate that. I understand your position, but I hope this can be resolved quickly." Jake hesitated, glancing at Janet. The lines of protocol and morality blurred in his mind. He had to tread carefully, not just for the sake of the moment, but for what it represented. "I'll take it from here," Jake said firmly, signaling for Janet to step aside. His decision, though simple on the surface, carried the weight of a moral stand, and he knew this was only the beginning. As the tension mounted around him, Barack Obama took a deep breath, allowing a moment of calm to wash over his rising frustration. The familiar weight of injustice pressed against him, not unfamiliar but no less heavy. His mind drifted back to another time, another moment when prejudice had reared its head in subtle but undeniable ways. It was during his first term as president. He had been invited to a high-profile diplomatic dinner overseas, a setting where protocol and decorum were paramount. He arrived early, stepping into the grand hall with its gilded chandeliers and impeccably dressed attendees. Despite the prestige of the event, he had been met with an unexpected barrier. A staff member at the entrance had stopped him, their expression hesitant yet firm. "I'm sorry, sir, but this area is restricted to invited guests only," they had said, their tone polite but laced with doubt. Obama had smiled patiently, explaining that he was indeed an invited guest, the invited guest. But the hesitation in the staffer's eyes lingered, betraying the unspoken question, could this man really be who he says he is? A senior official eventually intervened, recognizing him and apologizing profusely. The moment passed, outwardly, brushed aside as a misunderstanding, but the sting of it remained. Despite holding the highest office in the land, he was not immune to the quiet assumptions that trailed him. Now, standing at the security checkpoint, Obama felt that same sting. The scenario was different, but the underlying sentiment was all too familiar. He reflected on the lessons he had learned from that earlier experience, not to let anger consume him, not to let others dictate his worth. Instead, he had chosen to respond with dignity, using moments like these to highlight the very issues he had spent his life addressing. He looked around the checkpoint, his gaze sweeping over the uneasy crowd. He could see their discomfort, their silent acknowledgement of what was happening. For some, it was a painful reminder of their own experiences. For others, it was a revelation, a rare, public glimpse into the subtle but pervasive nature of prejudice. In the flashback, Obama had smiled at the staff member, not out of submission, but out of resolve. "It's all right," he had said. "We all make mistakes. The important thing is how we move forward." Now, in the present, those words echoed in his mind. He adjusted his posture, standing a little taller, his calm demeanor a deliberate choice. No matter how the situation unfolded, he would rise above it. He had before, and he would again. As Janet continued her scrutiny and Jake weighed his next move, Obama remained a steady presence, a man who had faced worse and yet continued to stand firm, not just for himself, but for those who looked to him as a symbol of resilience. The hum of conversation among the onlookers shifted as smartphones began appearing in hands like a wave rolling through the crowd. Quietly at first, then more visibly, passengers raised their phones to record the unfolding drama at Security Checkpoint C. The confrontation between Janet and Barack Obama, the former president now subjected to unwarranted scrutiny, was too compelling and too troubling to ignore. A young man whispered to his companion as he held his phone steady, "This is insane. How can this even happen to someone like him?" "It's not just him," the companion replied, shaking her head. "This happens all the time, to people who don't have his status." The room buzzed with murmurs as cameras captured every detail. Janet's pointed glances, her overly critical tone, and Obama's unwavering composure in the face of mounting disrespect. The tension in his posture, the way he carefully measured his words, resonated deeply with those watching. Maria, already frustrated, glanced at a group of college students holding up their phones. "Make sure you post this," she said firmly, her voice low but urgent. "People need to see what's happening here." As the recording devices captured the moment, the implications stretched far beyond the airport walls. Within minutes, snippets of the incident began appearing online. Short clips were shared on social media platforms, with captions like, "Even a former president isn't safe from prejudice. This is what systemic racism looks like in real time. Barack Obama questioned at airport. Unbelievable." DT comment sections exploded. Some expressed outrage and disbelief, while others defended the officer's actions, citing security protocol. The debate grew louder with each passing minute, reflecting the polarized nature of public discourse around racism and authority. Back at the checkpoint, the weight of being watched pressed on Janet, though she kept her focus on her role. For Obama, the moment was no longer just about him. He knew the significance of the growing number of cameras. It was about visibility, about accountability, and about sparking conversations that people might otherwise avoid. The viral moment ensured that the world outside the airport was now watching too. Have you ever felt like you had to prove your worth just to be treated fairly? Maybe it was at work, in school, or even during a routine interaction like this one. How did it make you feel? And what steps did you take to rise above the situation? Share your experiences in the comments below. Your story might inspire someone else to stand up for themselves or support others in need. We want to hear from you. Barack Obama stood still, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on his shoulders. The murmurs from the crowd faded into the background as his focus sharpened. It was clear this had gone beyond routine security protocol. His patience, long and practiced, was nearing its limit. Taking a measured breath, he finally spoke, his voice calm but resolute. "Ma'am, I appreciate the importance of your role. Ensuring the safety of everyone in this airport is no small responsibility, and I respect that." Janet glanced up, momentarily taken aback by his tone, neither confrontational nor submissive, but something in between. "But," Obama continued, his words cutting through the tension like a knife, "I have handed over every piece of documentation you've requested. My identification is valid, my credentials are in order, and yet here we are." Janet's grip on the ID tightened, her expression a mixture of defiance and discomfort. "Sir, as I said, I'm just doing my job. It's standard procedure." He nodded slightly, his gaze unwavering. "I understand the need for procedure, but I have to ask, what exactly about my documents seems suspicious to you? Is it the name, the photo, or is it something else entirely?" The room went silent. The subtle implication in his words was undeniable, and everyone present felt the weight of it. Janet hesitated, searching for a response that wouldn't confirm what the entire room already suspected. Obama didn't let the pause linger. "I've faced moments like this before," he said, his voice steady, though a hint of emotion seeped through. "Moments where it wasn't the rules being questioned, but something deeper, something more personal. And while I've learned to navigate those situations, it doesn't make them right. Not for me, not for anyone." The crowd's murmurs resumed, quiet but distinct. Some nodded in agreement, others whispered among themselves. Janet's posture stiffened as if bracing against the growing tide of judgment. "I'm not here to make this harder for you," Obama said, softening his tone, but not his stance. "But fairness matters, respect matters, and right now, this doesn't feel like either." Janet's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. She glanced around, noticing the watchful eyes of the passengers, the phones still recording, and the unmistakable shift in the room's energy. Obama let the silence hang for a moment before delivering his final words. "We all have a responsibility to do better, to see beyond assumptions and approach every person with the dignity they deserve. The question is, are we willing to rise to that responsibility?" The room felt charged with an electric tension as his words settled. Janet's face flushed, and though she didn't respond, the shift in her demeanor was unmistakable. The power of his logic, delivered with grace, had turned the tide of the moment. Jake Turner, the airport manager, stepped forward, his presence commanding attention. The room's tension shifted as all eyes turned to him. He could feel the weight of the situation. This wasn't just about protocol anymore. It was about justice, fairness, and the reputation of the airport he managed. Taking a steady breath, he extended his hand toward Janet. "May I see the documents, please?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. Janet hesitated for a brief moment, her reluctance visible as she handed over Obama's ID and travel papers. Jake took them, flipping through each page meticulously. The crowd watched in silence, anticipation hanging heavy in the air. As Jake reviewed the documents, his professionalism remained intact, but his expression betrayed a growing sense of disappointment. It was clear from the outset that the papers were authentic, leaving little room for doubt. He took an extra moment to ensure there were no discrepancies, an effort to leave no question unanswered. Finally, he looked up and handed the documents back to Obama. "Mr. Obama, I sincerely apologize for the inconvenience you've experienced today. Your credentials are in perfect order, and there was absolutely no need for this prolonged scrutiny." Obama nodded graciously. "Thank you, Mr. Turner. I appreciate you stepping in." Jake turned to Janet, his expression firm but not hostile. "Janet, I need to speak with you." His tone carried authority, but it wasn't harsh. It was laced with a sense of disappointment that cut deeper than anger. Janet's shoulders stiffened, her eyes darting nervously toward the crowd. "I was just following protocol," she said defensively, though her voice lacked conviction. Jake shook his head. "Protocol is important, but it doesn't excuse treating someone unfairly. This wasn't about the documents. It was about your assumptions. We can't allow prejudice, however subtle, to cloud our judgment," the crowd murmured softly, sensing the shift in power. Janet looked down, her face flushed with embarrassment as Jake's words sank in. Turning back to Obama, Jake offered a small apologetic smile. "We'll ensure this doesn't happen again, sir." Obama acknowledged him with a respectful nod, his composed demeanor unshaken. The moment was a small but significant step toward accountability, leaving the room with a sense that justice had begun to prevail. Janet's face flushed as Jake's words echoed in her mind. She straightened her posture, gripping the edge of the counter in front of her, and finally spoke, her voice defensive yet wavering. "I was just following protocol," she insisted, her eyes darting between Jake, Obama, and the onlookers who were still silently judging the situation. Jake raised an eyebrow, his expression calm but unwavering. "Protocol, Janet?" he asked, his voice even but firm. "Which part of the protocol requires you to scrutinize a globally recognized figure's identity with such intensity when there's no valid reason to do so?" Janet hesitated, her jaw tightening. "It's not about who he is," she replied, a slight edge of defiance creeping into her tone. "We're trained to be thorough, especially when something seems unusual." Obama tilted his head slightly, his expression calm but observant. "Unusual?" he repeated softly, his tone inviting further explanation. Janet faltered, but she pressed on. I mean, I've never seen someone traveling like this, alone, dressed casually. It raised red flags. The words hung in the air, heavier than Janet seemed to realize. The implication was clear, and the crowd shifted uneasily, the murmurs starting up again. Jake's disappointment deepened, though he kept his composure. Janet, we all know the importance of security, he said, but this wasn't about security, was it? Your actions went beyond protocol. They were rooted in assumptions, not evidence. Janet opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. She looked around, her gaze lingering on the recording phones, the watchful eyes of the passengers, and finally on Obama himself. For the first time, her confidence seemed to falter. I didn't mean... She started, her voice softer now, but she didn't finish the sentence. Her defenses, though still standing, were visibly cracking. Obama spoke, his tone steady but pointed. I understand the need for vigilance, but assumptions are dangerous. They can hurt people. They can reinforce the very biases we need to overcome. Janet's expression shifted from defiance to discomfort. She looked down at her hands, the weight of the moment finally settling in. Though she clung to her defensive protocol, it was clear even to her that it was no longer enough to justify her actions. The room remained silent, save for the quiet hum of tension still lingering. Obama took a deep breath, the weight of the moment pressing on him. He looked at Janet, then at the crowd, and finally began to speak, his voice calm yet resonant. Moments like this are difficult, he said, his tone measured, not just for the people directly involved, but for everyone watching. Because what's happening here isn't just about me. It's about something far bigger, something that touches all of us in ways we sometimes don't even notice. The crowd leaned in, their murmurs fading into silence. I've learned over the years that prejudice often doesn't announce itself with grand gestures or loud declarations. It hides in the small assumptions, the subtle looks, the unspoken judgments. And it's not just about what someone does, it's about the systems and norms that allow those actions to feel justified. Obama's gaze swept the room, pausing briefly on Janet, who now stood with her head lowered. I've been fortunate, he continued. I've had opportunities that many others haven't, but even with those opportunities, I've faced moments like this. Moments where my identity, my very existence, was questioned, not because of who I am, but because of what I represent. He paused, letting his words settle before continuing. These moments hurt. They make you question yourself, even when you know you've done nothing wrong. But they also remind us of the responsibility we all have, to challenge those assumptions, to question the biases we carry, and to build a world where fairness isn't conditional. A ripple of emotion spread through the crowd. Some nodded, their expressions thoughtful, while others appeared visibly moved. We all have biases, Obama said, his voice softening. It's part of being human. But the real question is, what do we do about them? Do we let them dictate our actions, or do we confront them, learn from them, and grow? He turned back to Janet, his tone neither accusatory nor forgiving, but deeply reflective. Today was a tough day for both of us, but it doesn't have to end here. We can use this moment, this uncomfortable, messy moment, as a chance to be better, to see each other more clearly, to treat each other with the respect and dignity we all deserve. The room hung on his words, a collective stillness enveloping the space. Because, at the end of the day, Obama concluded, change doesn't come from avoiding the hard conversations. It comes from facing them head-on and finding a better way forward. As Obama's words settled over the room, there was a brief silence, one heavy with reflection. Then a solitary clap echoed from the back of the crowd, quickly joined by others, until the entire room erupted into applause. Some passengers cheered, their voices breaking the tension that had gripped the space moments earlier. Others wiped tears from their eyes, visibly moved by the speech that had transcended the immediate incident to touch on something universal. A young man in the corner, phone still in hand, muttered to his friend, "That was incredible. He just spoke to everyone in the room, not just her." Nearby, a mother holding her child hugged him closer, her expression one of quiet reflection. "He's right," she whispered to her partner. "It's not just about her, it's about all of us." Janet stood frozen, the applause ringing in her ears. Her face was flushed, her hands trembling slightly as she looked around. She caught glimpses of the crowd, some staring at her with reproach, others with what seemed like cautious encouragement. Maria, standing off to the side, clapped with vigor, her eyes brimming with tears. She turned to a fellow passenger and said, "This is the kind of conversation we need. It's uncomfortable, but it's real." The energy in the room shifted. Where there had been tension and division, there was now a sense of unity, a shared understanding that this moment, as painful as it had been, held the potential for transformation. Even those who had remained silent earlier seemed to stand a little taller, their expressions softened by the realization that they had witnessed something profound. The applause continued, not just for Obama, but for the possibility of a better way forward. As the applause subsided, Jake stepped forward once again, addressing Janet with a calm but firm voice. "Janet, I need to speak with you privately," he said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Janet nodded stiffly, her face a mix of embarrassment and unease. The crowd parted as she followed Jake toward a side office, her head lowered but her step steady. Inside the office, Jake turned to face her. "Janet, you've been with us a long time, and I know you take your job seriously, but what happened out there today crossed a line." Janet opened her mouth to respond, but Jake raised a hand. "I'm not here to argue with you. I'm here to tell you that we can't operate this way. Not as individuals and not as an organization. Bias, whether intentional or not, has no place in how we treat our passengers." Her shoulders sagged, the weight of the moment finally settling in. "I didn't mean to. She trailed off, unable to find the words. Jake softened his tone slightly. "I believe you didn't mean harm. But intent doesn't erase impact. There will be consequences, Janet. We'll discuss them formally later, but for now, I need you to reflect on what happened here and why." She nodded quietly, her earlier defiance now replaced by a somber understanding. "Do you think standing up to discrimination can truly lead to change? History has shown us that real progress often begins with individuals who have the courage to speak up, even when it's uncomfortable. Have you ever been in a situation where you or someone else took a stand against prejudice or unfair treatment? What happened and how did it impact those involved? Your experiences matter, and sharing them could inspire someone else to take action in their own life. Let us know your thoughts and stories in the comments below. Together, we can learn from each other and continue striving for a fairer, more inclusive world. As the tension in the room subsided, Jake Turner emerged from the private meeting with Janet, his face solemn but resolute. He approached Barack Obama, who remained composed despite the ordeal, and extended his hand. "Mr. Obama," Jake began, his voice steady but filled with sincerity. "On behalf of the airport administration, I want to extend my deepest apologies for what you've experienced here today. This should never have happened." Obama accepted the handshake with a nod, his expression gracious. "Thank you, Mr. Turner. What matters now is how we move forward from this." Jake turned to address the gathered crowd, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to acknowledge that what you've witnessed today was unacceptable. as an institution, we are committed to ensuring that every traveler is treated with respect and dignity, regardless of their background or identity. The crowd listened intently, some nodding in approval. The statement wasn't just for Obama, it was for everyone who had ever felt unseen or unfairly treated in spaces like these. Shortly after, an official statement was released by the airport administration addressing the incident directly. It read, "We deeply regret the events that occurred today involving former President Barack Obama. We have taken immediate action to address the situation, including initiating disciplinary measures for the staff involved and reviewing our procedures. To ensure such an incident does not happen again, we are committed to fostering an environment that upholds the values of equality, fairness, and respect." The apology quickly spread through social media, shared alongside videos of the incident. Public responses were a mix of relief and hope, with many praising the swift acknowledgement of wrongdoing and the commitment to change. For Janet, the consequences were immediate. She was placed on leave pending further investigation, a clear signal that her actions would not be overlooked or excused. Though visibly shaken, she remained quiet, perhaps beginning to reflect on the weight of her choices. This moment became a turning point, not just for the airport, but as a larger statement. About accountability, the swift and public response sent a clear message: prejudice, whether overt or subtle, would not be tolerated. Justice, though delayed, had been served. The focus now shifted toward ensuring the lessons from this incident would shape a more equitable future. The incident at Security Checkpoint C rippled far beyond the immediate confrontation. For Jake Turner, the airport manager, the events of that day weren't just a wake-up call, they were a mandate for change. The tension, the crowd's reactions, and the undeniable presence of prejudice in an institution meant to serve everyone equally had left an indelible mark. Jake knew that addressing the incident publicly was only the first step. The real work lay in changing the culture that had allowed such behavior to occur in the first place. At the next management meeting, Jake stood before his peers, his voice steady but charged with urgency. What happened at that checkpoint wasn't just about one officer, he began. It exposed systemic cracks, flaws that could tarnish not only our reputation but the trust passengers place in us. If we want to rebuild that trust, we have to confront these issues head-on. The room fell silent as he continued, outlining his vision for change. This isn't about assigning blame, it's about responsibility, and our responsibility is to make sure that every traveler, regardless of their background, is treated with dignity and fairness. That starts here, with us. Jake's proposals were sweeping and ambitious. At the heart of his plan was a mandatory diversity and bias training program for all airport staff, from security personnel to senior management. The program, designed in collaboration with experts in diversity, equity, and inclusion, was tailored to the unique challenges faced by high-pressure environments like airports. The training sessions were immersive and interactive, focusing on the subtle ways unconscious bias could influence decision-making. Role-playing scenarios helped employees understand the impact of their actions, while group discussions encouraged them to reflect on their own assumptions and behaviors. "It's not about pointing fingers," Jake explained during a staff briefing. "It's about understanding, learning, and growing." To complement the training, Jake implemented a comprehensive review of the airport's security protocols. A third-party team of diversity and inclusion consultants was brought in to audit existing procedures and recommend changes to minimize the influence of bias. Their findings led to the standardization of certain practices, ensuring that every passenger was treated equally under clearly defined guidelines. Jake also introduced an anonymous feedback system, giving both employees and passengers a voice. The system allowed individuals to report incidents of bias or unfair treatment without fear of retaliation. Every report was reviewed by a newly formed oversight committee, which ensured transparency and accountability in addressing complaints. As news of the airport's initiatives spread, it became a model for other institutions grappling with similar issues. Advocacy groups lauded the efforts, and travelers expressed renewed confidence in the airport's commitment to fairness. In interviews, Jake remained humble. "This isn't about erasing what happened, it's about learning from it," he said. "We can't promise perfection, but we can promise progress. And I hope other organizations see that it's possible to turn a difficult moment into a meaningful opportunity for change." The changes didn't just transform the airport, they set a precedent for what accountability and inclusivity could look like in practice. Later that evening, Maria Sanchez sat in her hotel room, her thoughts consumed by the day's events. She replayed the scene at the security checkpoint in her mind, the tension, the confrontation, and Obama's powerful speech. The experience had left her both shaken and inspired. She knew she couldn't let the moment pass without doing something. Maria opened her laptop and began typing, her words flowing as she recounted the events in vivid detail. She described the scrutiny Barack Obama had endured, the unjust assumptions made by the officer, and the grace with which he had handled the situation. She included her own perspective, sharing how the incident had opened her eyes to the subtle yet pervasive ways prejudice manifests in everyday life. "This wasn't just about a former president," she wrote. "This was about how we, as a society, treat people based on appearances and assumptions. It was a reminder that even those who have achieved so much are not immune to the biases that linger in our systems. We have to do better." Maria posted her account on social media, attaching a short video she had taken during the confrontation. The clip showed Obama addressing the officer with calm dignity, his words resonating with the crowd. Within hours, the post began to gain traction. Likes, comments, and shares poured in, turning her personal reflection into a viral moment. People from around the world responded with outrage, empathy, and support. Comments ranged from expressions of solidarity to personal stories of facing discrimination. "This is why we need accountability," one commenter wrote. "What happened to Obama could happen to anyone, and it's not okay." Maria's post sparked a broader conversation about systemic racism and the importance of standing up against injustice. News outlets picked up the story, amplifying its reach. What had begun as a small act of sharing became a rallying cry, uniting people around the world in a call for change. Maria, though surprised by the response, felt hopeful. Her words and actions had made a difference, proving that speaking up, even in a small way, could have a powerful impact. In the days following the incident, Janet found herself alone with her thoughts more often than she was comfortable with. The immediate disciplinary action and the viral nature of the confrontation had left her feeling exposed. The spotlight wasn't just on what she had done, it was on what it represented. At first, she had defended her actions to herself. "I was just doing my job," she would mutter, the phrase echoing hollowly in her mind. But as she replayed the events, particularly Obama's calm yet pointed words, a deeper truth began to settle in. His statement, "Bias, whether intentional or not, has no place in how we treat each other," was like a mirror reflecting her own behavior. Janet realized that what she had dismissed as protocol had been influenced by her unconscious. And biases? She thought about the assumptions she had made, not just that day, but throughout her career. How many people had been on the receiving end of her suspicion simply because they didn't fit her preconceived ideas? Determined to change, Janet decided to confront her biases head-on. She began attending diversity and inclusion workshops offered by the airport's new initiatives. The sessions were uncomfortable at first. Hearing about the experiences of others forced her to confront the harm her actions might have caused. She also started reading books and watching documentaries that offered perspectives different from her own. Each story she encountered opened her eyes to the subtle ways prejudice shaped the lives of others. Gradually, she began to see the world, and her role in it, with new clarity. Janet's journey wasn't easy, and it wasn't linear, but it was real. Over time, she came to understand that growth wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning from it and committing to do better. She hoped that her efforts, though late, could still make a difference. As the dust settled from the day's events, Barack Obama stood in front of a small group in the airport's conference room. Among them were Jake, Maria, and a few senior members of the airport staff. The crowd had dispersed and the immediate tension had eased, but the weight of the incident still lingered in the air. Obama, ever composed, began to speak. "Today wasn't easy for any of us," he said, his voice steady but warm. "But moments like these, as difficult as they are, give us a chance to reflect, not just on what went wrong, but on how we can do better moving forward." He turned to Jake, his expression one of quiet gratitude. "Jake, I want to thank you for stepping in when it mattered. Taking responsibility and addressing issues like this head-on isn't easy, but it's necessary. Leadership means more than following rules. It means standing for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable." Jake nodded, humbled by the acknowledgement. Then Obama turned to Maria, a small smile breaking through his otherwise serious demeanor. "Maria, your courage didn't go unnoticed. You saw something wrong and you didn't stay silent. That takes bravery, especially in a world where it's easier to turn away. Your actions today were a reminder that every voice matters." Maria's eyes glistened as she nodded in response, her gratitude evident. Addressing the group as a whole, Obama concluded, "This incident was painful, but it's also a chance to grow. Change doesn't happen overnight. It takes consistent effort and a willingness to confront our flaws. But I believe in the power of people to do just that. Every small step matters, and every moment of progress builds toward a future where fairness and dignity are the norm, not the exception." His words left the room in thoughtful silence, inspiring everyone present to continue striving for a more just and inclusive world. As Barack Obama prepared to leave the airport, his final words to those who had gathered remained etched in their minds. His quote, spoken with quiet conviction, "Change happens when ordinary people stand up for what's right," was a reminder that progress begins with individual action. The day's events had revealed the subtle but pervasive nature of prejudice, and the collective response had shown the power of speaking up. For Jake, Maria, and even Janet, the incident became a defining moment, one that challenged them to re-evaluate their roles in fostering equality and fairness. For the onlookers, the viral videos, and the countless people who followed the story, it became a call to action. Conversations about bias and systemic racism erupted across social media, workplaces, and homes. People reflected on their own assumptions, sharing personal stories of times they had spoken up or regretted staying silent. "This isn't just about me," Obama had said during his speech. "It's about all of us. Each of us has the power to make a difference, whether it's through our words, our actions, or the way we treat others every day." The message was simple, yet profound. Prejudice thrives in silence, but courage can break the cycle. The incident, though painful, became a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in moments of injustice, the seeds of change can be planted. Have you ever witnessed someone overcome adversity and inspire meaningful change? Moments like these remind us of the power of resilience and the impact of standing up for what's right. What steps do you think we can all take to challenge prejudice in our own lives and foster a more inclusive world? Share your experiences and thoughts in the comments below. Your story could inspire someone else to take action. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you or made you think, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. For more stories that highlight real-world issues and inspire change, let us know in the comments what you think about this incident and how we can work together to build a more just and inclusive world. See you in the next video.